Let's dive right into this explainer. When we think of the 19th century, it's so easy to get caught up in the sweeping narratives of monarchs and the Industrial Revolution. But to really understand this era, we have to look past all of that. We need to reconstruct an entire human world through the eyes of its most vulnerable inhabitants, the Victorian street child. Over the next few minutes, we're going to explore the profound systemic forces, the harsh economic constraints, the brutal urban geography, and the sheer institutional apathy that structured their daily survival. In the primary sources from the time, they reveal a truly staggering loss of youth. Take this 1865 eyewitness account from investigative journalist Henry Mayhew. It pulls us immediately into this grim reality. I want you to picture this: an 8-year-old girl shuffling through severe weather in adult-sized carpet slippers, wrapped in a threadbare shawl. Her entire geographic understanding of the world began and ended with selling watercress. Mayhew observed that she was, essentially, an infant who spoke with the calm, chilling earnestness of someone who had already endured the bitterest struggles of life. Part 1. The Architecture of Destitution, the Geography of the Urban Slum. So, how did they live? Well, unprecedented population growth and mass migration to cities birthed a physical environment that was, literally, a sensory nightmare. Enter the rookery. Named after the crammed, noisy nesting habits of the rook bird, it was a labyrinth of unpaved alleys absolutely choked with raw sewage. The stench of industrial waste was everywhere. And because of the era's window taxes, landlords would often just board up the openings. This plunged these unventilated rooms into perpetual darkness, creating the perfect incubator for disease and desperation. Within these slums, we see a really desperate hierarchy of shelter. A child's survival often hinged on scraping together just a few pennies. If they had a little money, they might afford a lice-infested doss house, sleeping upright inside a 4-penny coffin, which was exactly what it sounds like, a wooden box. For the completely destitute, though, they were relegated to the open streets. They'd seek refuge under damp bridge arches or huddle in flooded cellars, totally exposed to freezing temperatures, rats, and the elements. Part 2. The Workhouse and Poor Law, the Institutional Threat. Now, for those who simply couldn't survive on the streets, the state did offer an alternative, but it was deliberately designed as a psychological and economic weapon. The 1834 Poor Law was governed by this concept called the principle of less eligibility. Basically, the governing classes believed that handing out relief outside of institutions just bred dependency. So they made a law dictating that conditions inside a state workhouse had to be intentionally harsher and more punitive than the life of the lowest paid free laborer outside. The entire goal was strict deterrence. You can see exactly why reformers like Richard Osler called them prisons for the poor. The moment you crossed the threshold, you were systematically stripped of your human dignity. Families were immediately fractured. Husbands, wives, and children were segregated into completely different wards. Inmates had their heads shaved, they were forced into institutional uniforms, and survived on a monotonous, unyielding diet. And their days consumed by grueling, pointless manual labor like breaking stones or picking apart tarred rope just to earn their keep. Part 3. The Economics of Childhood, the Commodification of Vulnerable Lives. Because that new poor law removed family wage subsidies, desperately poor children were thrust right into the unforgiving labor market. They became highly active economic actors. And perhaps the most harrowing example of this commodification was the climbing boys. Master sweeps actively preferred children as young as 4 or 5. Why? Because only a child that small could fit into the pitch-black, narrow flues of Victorian chimneys, some of which measured just 12 by 7.5 inches. It was a suffocating, lethal job filled with horrors like soot cancer, stunted limbs, and brutal physical coercion from their masters. And the legislative history here reveals the agonizing, almost unbelievable apathy of the 19th century political economy. It took nearly a century of contested, half-hearted reforms just to stop forcing little children up chimneys. Early laws in 1788 and 1834 were universally ignored because, frankly, there was zero enforcement. Subsequent bans were easily evaded. It wasn't until 1875, when police licensing was strictly mandated, that this barbaric occupational hazard was finally stamped out. Part 4. Disease and the Demographic Paradox, the Cost of Survival. Beyond the grueling labor, a street child's physiological existence was a daily battle against chronic malnutrition and lethal pathogens. Surviving on literal scraps while drinking water from the contaminated River Thames meant that infectious diseases like cholera and typhus were swift, merciless killers. The pathology of poverty is just staggering. When social reformer Henrietta Barnett observed the Sutton workhouse, 38% of the children were actively severely ill. We're talking rampant chilblains, which is this incredibly painful skin blistering from extreme cold, widespread ophthalmia, ringworm, and devastating dental health issues like abscesses and severe oral ulcerations. But this brings us to a really fascinating demographic paradox. If you look at the data, life expectancy at birth for an urban laborer was a shocking 22 years. But that number was heavily skewed by astronomical infant mortality rates, mostly driven by waterborne diseases. Here's the paradox. If a working-class child was resilient enough, or just lucky enough, to miraculously survive past the perilous age of 5, their life expectancy completely transformed. Men who survived that initial gauntlet actually had a statistical probability of living all the way into their mid-70s.
Part 5. Philanthropy and Ragged Schools. The Reformers' Response.
While the state relied on the punitive deterrence of those workhouses, all this visible misery did spark some localized philanthropic responses. Reformers like Mary Carpenter and Dr. Thomas Bernardo established what they called ragged schools. This was a profound paradigm shift, replacing institutional punishment with basic education and shelter. Bernardo actually abandoned his medical training entirely after a destitute boy named Jim Jarvis showed him a hidden world of children sleeping on freezing rooftops. These ragged schools operated on one absolutely vital principle. No destitute child would ever be refused admission. Part 6. The Imperial Exile, a Systematic Solution. However, when domestic charity just wasn't enough to clear the streets of visible poverty, the systemic solution turned to geopolitical extraction. 130,000. That is the staggering number of British home children who were exiled to dominions like Canada and Australia between the 1860s and 1970s. You see, when families yielded to poverty and had to enter the workhouse, the state and charitable organizations frequently stepped in and shipped these children overseas, very often without the parents' knowledge or consent. Now, this imperial displacement was publicly framed as a grand philanthropic rescue mission. The reality, though, laid bare the deep inequalities of 19th century capitalism. These children were sent across the globe supposedly to populate and build the empire, but they frequently found themselves exploited as uneducated, unpaid farm laborers. And this wasn't exactly a secret at the time. As early as 1874, Commissioner Andrew Doyle officially condemned the system, noting that thousands of children were, quote, cast adrift to be overworked or mistreated. The physical rookeries of the 19th century have long since been demolished, but the questions they raise are still deeply relevant. We've seen how institutions shaped choices, how urban geography dictated health, and how economics literally commodified the most vulnerable among us. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to leave pondering this. How do the historical shadows of the Victorian street child still inform our modern understanding of systemic poverty? And how much of that same institutional apathy still echoes in the way our own society treats its most vulnerable citizens today?